Good evening. It lasted for 126 days and was over in a matter of minutes. A daring daylight raid ending the 4-month ordeal of those hostages in Peru. But how did the captives curb their despair during those long weeks? What was it really like living in that cramped compound held at gunpoint by heavily armed guerrillas? Dateline's been on the scene since the crisis ended, and tonight Josh Mankiewicz has the inside story. Exclusive new video of the commandos and harrowing accounts of the siege from the Dateline survivors.
The world is taken by surprise. Elite counter-terrorist troops bringing to a dramatic conclusion one of the longest hostage crises in history. Months of plotting negotiation ending in 45 minutes of explosions and gunfire. A day of deliverance and death. It all began a week before Christmas, 7 p.m. December 17th. The birthday of Japan's emperor is being honored inside the Japanese ambassador's home, half a world away in Lima, Peru. Located in one of the most fashionable neighborhoods in Lima, the house is set behind a 15-foot wall topped with an electric fence. Guests move down the driveway, past the marble columns, through the house, then out back to the tented yard. Chris Merschrod, an American, arrives about 7:30.
It was already in full bloom, and a beautiful garden they had set up with delicious Japanese food as well as traditional food from Peru.
Local television is here covering the event. The guest list reads like a who's who of Lima, including the U.S. ambassador, other U.S. and foreign diplomats, international business leaders, and Peru's political and military elite. The president of Peru's mother, sister, and brother are all here, escorted by an elite member of the president's security team. But the security inside the house is remarkably out of the ordinary. Dr. Miguel Sanchez Palacios, a heart surgeon trained at Johns Hopkins University, enters with his wife.
We walked inside. There was this little table with a lady, took our invitation. I have to say that she did not check who we were. She just took the invitation and we walked in.
Father Juan Julio Vict, a Jesuit priest, notices the same thing.
Certainly it was light and not enough. Looking at the results.
While the dignitaries enter, across town some heavily armed, uninvited guests videotape themselves climbing into an ambulance before driving to the house next door to the ambassadors. Around 8:15, these party crashers literally explode on the scene.
We heard a sharp explosion, which I thought was a bomb, a car bomb, perhaps a block or two away.
It's not a car bomb. Instead, roughly 20 members of the MRTA, a homegrown left-wing terrorist organization, are attacking the Japanese ambassador's party. They enter from next door after blowing a hole in the security wall.
Then the shooting started.
These are the terrifying sounds of the actual attack, captured on this video shot by the cameraman who had just left the party and obtained exclusively by Dateline.
You see this cloud of dust, and they were coming out of it.
They were agitated, they were nervous, they were swinging their guns around, they were shouting. It was extremely loud, it was extremely close, and it was punctuated by a lot of loud explosions.
The explosions are hand grenades targeted at roughly a dozen security personnel. Out front, police engage in a ferocious gun battle with the heavily armed terrorists, shooting one in the leg. Inside the tent, Peruvian military officials frantically tear the insignia from their uniforms in an effort to mask their rank as rebels charge the hundreds of stunned guests.
They were shouting, keep your heads down, you know, if you lift your heads up, we'll shoot them off.
I said, my God, I'm going to die. I held my wife, we threw it to the floor. We threw into the floor like everybody else did.
Within minutes after the first shots are fired, the insurgents, needing better protection from police gunfire, begin herding the guests from the tent toward the entrance to the house, some terrorists using guests as human shields. Meanwhile, the battle outside rages for 40 minutes until, outgunned and outmaneuvered, the police pull back.
And I thought it was like, 40 hours. It just, like it never ended.
Then we were all told to get up. They said, put your hands Manos en la nuca, behind your head like this.
Word of the attack quickly spreads to family members of those trapped inside, including the Palacios' 26-year-old daughter, Leah.
I just started watching TV and waiting to see if anyone was hurt at first.
El movimiento revolucionario Tupac Amaru.
I was scared that they would be, both of them, dead. So that was my first thought. What am I going to do now if they are both gone?
Inside the house, the same sort of fear.
They wanted us sitting on the floor because it was easier to shoot us there. Everybody packed together, you come with a machine gun and, you know, kill everybody. That's what I thought. I think most people thought that too.
Less than an hour after the first shots were fired, the now reinforced police presence located at the front gate launches a counterstrike, firing tear gas into the residents in an effort to smoke out the terrorists.
I just recall 2 waves of tear gas. One was very mild, but then the second one was really difficult. It required a lot of control to keep from choking.
When we felt these tear gases, the other ladies started screaming.
The tear gas is effective, but only on the hostages.
Immediately, the terrorists had masks against these tear gases. They were well equipped.
Hostages scream in agony. The Japanese ambassador grabs a rebel's bullhorn and pleads with police to stop firing. Police oblige, and in less than 2 hours, the MRTA has captured the house and 700 hostages. One man secretly escapes through a bathroom window and silently slips away. With so many hostages, including the mother, sister, and brother of the Peruvian president trapped inside, outside, tough questions are already being asked of police. How could 20 terrorists capture 700 of the most influential people in Peru? Why was security so lax? Would the government negotiate with the terrorists? Or would Peru's elite counter-terrorist troops use their training to liberate the hostages? As both sides dig in, one of the party guests confronts the terrorists. He is Michel Minig, chief of the local International Red Cross. Minig quickly cuts a deal for the release of all the women.
My wife didn't want to leave, so I pushed her. I said, go, go. I gave her the keys of the car. I said, go, please go. One dead is enough in the family.
Minig leads the women out, one small group at a time. Some of the women still suffering from the tear gas. Yolanda Palacios calls her daughters to tell them she's coming home.
When I heard my mom's voice after 3.5 hours of not knowing how they were, I burst into tears.
Around midnight, the last of the 200 women is released, including the mother and sister of the Peruvian president, either of whom might have given the terrorists greater leverage in dealing with President Fujimori.
And they explained it in the following way, that we're sending the women home because the woman's place is in the home, taking care of the children, preparing meals.
So I said, you know, I'm a physician, and I'm here because my wife was invited. She's at home now, and I'm here.
The roughly 20 rebels, 2 of whom are women, now hold roughly 400 hostages. They make this slightly more manageable by letting the elderly and infirm men go free, along with the catering staff. But as the waiters depart, an attempted escape. The rebel closest to the door starts to raise her gun to shoot the escaping hostage, but changes her mind. Red Cross Representative Minig comes quickly to defuse the situation. For the very first time, Michel Minig talks about that terrifying moment.
I believed that some shooting was about to start, and I said, don't shoot, don't shoot. This is exactly the kind of situation when nothing is under control.
Ironically, this man running from the house is the presidential family's bodyguard, who stripped off his uniform and put on a towel to avoid being identified.
By 1 a.m., the hundreds of men inside the house are frisked, then divided up, with politically and militarily important hostages forced upstairs, where the rebels believe they'll be easier to guard. The earlier attempt by some military officers to hide their identity by removing their uniform insignias fails when the rebels find a comprehensive guest list.
The lights were turned off, and then I was alone, I was with a room jammed with people, but I was alone. And I'm sure everybody there was alone too.
But such philosophical thoughts soon give way to more practical problems. 400 people share a house built for 6, and with too many people jockeying for too few chairs, the toilet becomes a cherished throne, and one man on it, an envied king.
I mean, he was lucky. He had a seat. But he would have, every now and then somebody wanted to use the toilet. So they would wake him up, you know, and somebody would use the toilet and would sit again and sleep again, and he'd spend all the night, you know, waking and sitting up and waking and standing. But he was in the toilet. He was sitting on the toilet.
While hostages struggle for space, terrorists and police prepare for the dawn. Inside the residence, rebels finish securing the compound. They mine the grounds, set booby traps around entrances, pile furniture in front of doors and windows, and station sentries in upstairs lookout posts. The rebels thought their plans were perfect, but had they made some fatal mistakes?
When we return, the hostage-taking turns into an agonizing ordeal, and the captives consider a daring course of action.
We talked about, we're 490 of us. It's only 15 of them. Can we do something about it? Should we do something about it?
From Studio 3B in New York, here is Jane Pauley.
Returning to our story, rebels in Peru now hold 400 hostages at the Japanese ambassador's residence. Rooms are crowded, sanitary conditions are poor, and tensions are running high among the captives. They have no idea that this is just the beginning of their long ordeal. Here again, Josh Mankiewicz.
December 18th, the city awakens to a new chapter in its war on terrorism, a war that raged for 10 years, a war that claimed 30,000 lives, a war that most people believe the government had already won.
The irony of this particular incident is that everybody believed that this group had virtually been eliminated, that they had very little capacity to carry out such a spectacular, dramatic action.
The group, the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, known by its Spanish initials MRTA, is virtually unknown outside of Peru. That changed overnight.
Now to our top story this morning, that hostage drama in Lima, Peru.
Perhaps boasting of their success, the terrorists released this home video showing how they planned the raid, a plan a year in the making. The video shows them using a sophisticated scale model, along with surveillance photos of the compound to coordinate the attack. Snapshots of potential party guests help them identify valuable hostages, and this planning pays off. The terrorists now hold 400 hostages.
Very heavily armed and trained to kill.
We thought we were going to be killed. You're just frightened. You're frightened.
The rebels, on the other hand, seem completely at ease.
And they were very, very calm, and they weren't afraid. And there were 20 of us for every one of them.
The terrorists call in their demands to local radio and TV stations. Their principal demand? The immediate release of 400 of their comrades, most of whom are held in Peruvian maximum security prison cells. Cells so small they've been described as living graves. The Peruvian government responds with silence. At noon, the rebels up the ante.
Rebels who took hundreds of diplomats and other top officials hostage at a glittering reception have now threatened today to start killing them within minutes.
And I said, my life has been complete. I don't need anything more. I can die. I'm ready. I've had a great life.
The deadline passes, but inside the house, the possibility that there will be executions is very real, especially to one group of hostages.
One of the first concerns in this whole seizure, hostage taking, was being an American.
And Chris Merschrod has good reason for concern. The terrorist group has historically aimed its most vicious attacks at U.S. targets, including this rocket-propelled grenade attack on the U.S. Embassy and multiple bombings of this fried chicken chain. But even with 7 Americans trapped inside, 6 of them embassy personnel, back home the U.S. State Department takes a hard line.
The United States, as I say, has a strong policy against making any concessions, and we'd advise all of those involved to to follow that policy.
But when it comes to being tough on terrorism, the U.S. is preaching to the choir. Peru's President Fujimori came to power promising to crush terrorist groups. It's a promise he has spent the last 6 years trying to keep.
His whole reputation, the success that he's had as president of Peru for the last over 6 years, has been based on being tough, on not yielding, on not negotiating in these kind of situations.
In 6 years, Peru's government thought they'd captured or killed virtually every rebel leader in both the MRTA and the more vicious and infamous Shining Path, a terrorist group so feared that the capture and imprisonment of its leader was treated like the unveiling of a dangerous and exotic zoo animal. Now a new rebel threat has emerged. Inside this house, the man in charge is Nestor Serpa. A one-time union leader, Serpa now has over a dozen terrorists under his command and 400 hostages under his thumb.
Tell me about Serpa.
I'm sorry. He seemed to me a man with serious psychological problems, a fanatic.
22 hours into the crisis, Serpa tries to quick-start negotiations by sending out the diplomats from Canada, Greece, Germany, and France. The four announced they're willing to re-enter the house as needed to negotiate a non-violent end to the crisis.
There was a hope, well, this is good. There'll be communication. But we didn't have much of a discussion when they didn't come back.
The Peruvian government declines the help and promptly sends the diplomats on their way. And in a show of strength, police cut phone lines, jam cellular service, and shut off power to the residents. The crisis is 36 hours old.
There were so many more hostages than there were terrorists.
Yes.
Did anybody think about trying to jump them?
The idea, I am sure, crossed the minds of many.
Then we said no. I mean, none of us know how to use a machine gun. We're older people. Are we going to jump these guys? And so we decided we were not going to do that unless we were threatened.
The 2,600 square foot house, designed to look like Tara from Gone with the Wind, is now an overcrowded prison. The hostages are split up into 8 groups and ordered into rooms lettered by the rebels A through H. There are just 4 bathrooms for the roughly 400 men, an inconvenience made worse when police cut off running water.
And of course, when the water was cut off, that became a problem for flushing. But very quickly, people improvised with plastic bags and cartons.
But as unpleasant and as frightening as the waiting game is for the hostages, it quickly becomes tense and monotonous for the rebels. Perhaps to break that monotony, the rebels begin every day to kick a soccer ball around the living room of the house. That does break the tension, but it's a routine they will live to regret.
Once a day, the TV is commandeered by the 2 female terrorists who spent their childhood in a small village without television. But now, these 2 heavily armed young women have quickly become addicted to Maria in the Barrio, a local soap opera.
And they were just sitting there like so many swooning teenage girls do.
Teenage girls armed with fully automatic AK-47 assault rifles and plastic explosives.
There was always the fear that they would shoot us. You felt confident that it was probably not going to happen, but every now and then you would look at their machine gun and say, uh-oh.
Also concerned is the U.S. government. In Washington, the president is tight-lipped.
We are having communications with them, and I think the less any of us around the world say beyond that, the better.
The Peruvian president does finally speak out, saying he supports a peaceful solution, but will never agree to the terrorist demand that he release 400 MRTA prisoners. With negotiations at a standstill, family members, including the wife and younger daughter of Dr. Palacios, marched through the streets to send a message to President Fujimori.
We just can't stand this anymore. He needs to realize that the life of the people is the first thing.
The government agrees to let the Red Cross supply the house with drinking water, disinfectant, and medication for the hostages. And while the days-old party food is still feeding some inhabitants of the compound, fresh food is also delivered daily to the surprisingly disinterested hostages.
Even though we had a lot of food, nobody went to eat, so they wouldn't have to go to the bathroom.
As the days pass, these gun-toting terrorists work at becoming less threatening. It is a calculated strategy.
They want to convince us we're the good guys. The government, they're the bad guys. And although it's strange to have somebody with a machine gun smiling at you or being nice to you, that's what really happened.
Que Dios los bendiga.
Just before Christmas, the terrorists announced they will release all non-essential hostages, meaning everyone who's not a political or military official.
There was a point at which they said you could go. Tell me about that.
A list of people, long list, were named to get out.
And your name was on that list?
My name was on the list.
But Dr. Palacios still worries about his own future.
I was taking blood pressures all over the place, and I thought, what am I doing? I may not be released if I'm the guy who's taking care of all these sick people.
Word of the release reaches the families of the hostages, but not a list of who or how many.
It's 5 days of getting like really high hopes and then down and high and down and up and down. Like you feel that someone's playing with you.
After midnight, buses arrive at the house and 225 hostages begin filing out. But after 5 days in captivity, American Chris Merschrod refuses to get aboard and instead walks out front and hails a cab.
And it was nice to breathe the air and just to walk.
What was it like?
Very tough, extremely tough. We're very happy now.
When I saw him getting into the bus, that's the moment when I jumped and shouted and screamed and laughed and ran all around the house. That's when I was sure he was coming home.
But even as this family embraces the new year together, Father Vic makes a decision. He's going to stay inside and save souls, even though it means risking his own life.
You could have left? Sure. But you chose to stay?
Of course.
You say of course, but most people would have left if they'd had the opportunity.
I don't know. I thought it was my duty to stay there.
What Father Vic didn't know was that the next 100 days would be filled with uncertainty, misery, and terror.
When we return, the brutal reality of life during the long siege and the stunning commando assault on the compound.
I just dropped to the ground, saying, that is it.
You thought this was the end?
That was the end.
More than 300 of the hostages taken by the rebels have now been allowed to leave the ambassador's residence in Peru. Those remaining are just beginning to realize they may be in for a long siege. Josh Mankiewicz again picks up the story.
The Christmas-time release of hostages raises the hopes of families and friends that the crisis is nearly over. The government relaxes the perimeter around the house. The press, allowed to move in close to the house, exploit their new location by rushing past police and into the residence. What appears to be a publicity boon to the rebels turns out to be a terrible miscalculation when this impromptu press conference embarrasses and angers the government. On New Year's Day, President Fujimori cuts off all communication with the terrorists. Relatives of the hostages are getting impatient too.
The waiting period is pretty much over. If people are going to die, it's hard to say it, but if people are going to die, let it be.
Publicly, the government isn't saying much, but behind the scenes, they're planning another set of actions. The job of storming the residence would belong to these troops, who train away from the prying eyes of the press. This video was obtained exclusively by Dateline only after we agreed not to air it until the crisis was over, in order to protect the troops and the hostages. The video shows elite soldiers practicing rescuing hostages under different circumstances. On a bus, aboard an airplane, and inside a house. Meanwhile, inside the ambassador's house, the terrorists are doing some training of their own. Bolivian ambassador Jorge Gumucio.
They did some drillings on coming to each room, pointing us that they were going to use the machine gun against us. Several times, Serpa told us, look, everybody, I am not going to shoot you. We are not going to kill you. But the moment that the government begins an attack, you will be dead because the president of Peru is killing you.
Outside, as the crisis enters its 40th day, the government gives the terrorists something to worry about when it launches what appears to be a psychological attack. Huge speakers aimed at the house blare a mind-numbing mix of martial music, police sirens, and roaring aircraft. Armored personnel carriers and troops circle the house as part of what appears to be a simulated attack, all designed in part to unnerve the terrorists. The terrorists respond by opening fire. One shot ricochets off an armored vehicle, just missing the nearby soldiers. Perhaps the only thing keeping the soldiers from immediately storming the house is this flag. Under international law, the ambassador's house is considered Japanese territory, and the Japanese deal with terrorists differently than do the Peruvians.
Their response to similar situations has not tended to be as hardline and as tough.
In part to appease the Japanese, who invest heavily in Peru's economy, President Fujimori reopens negotiations with the hostage takers in February. But even as the government drives terrorists across the street for negotiations, beneath the same street, a plan is being launched to liberate the hostages.
Did the terrorists ever talk to you about how they thought the government was digging a tunnel?
Yes, and they said, how come they can talk about negotiations and dialogue if they are making a tunnel to attack?
After 4 months, the terrorists reportedly threatened to stop daily visits by a doctor who's treating various hostages, angering President Fujimori. He decides to act and deploys anti-terrorist troops in 4-foot-wide, well-lit and ventilated tunnels dug beneath the ambassador's home. For 3 days, anti-terrorist police monitor the house from inside the now completed tunnels. Finally, President Fujimori is given the news he's been waiting for. 8 of the 14 rebels are playing soccer in the living room, leaving the hostages upstairs and lightly guarded. He gives the word, proceed immediately.
It was no accident that the attack came during the rebels' regular afternoon soccer game, because somehow the Peruvian government had found a way to learn exactly what was happening inside that house.
Did the hostages know in advance that the government was coming in?
Yes, few minutes before the attack, some of the hostages were informed because they were in contact with the military forces.
How could they be in contact?
I don't know, because I was a civilian. I didn't know how the militaries work.
But there was some system for passing information back and
yeah,
forth?
Since the third day, there was already ways of getting information.
The third day you were in captivity?
Yes.
And that continued for another 123 days?
Yes, through electronic means.
How did soldiers know what was going on inside? For one thing, they used sophisticated night vision equipment. There was a report a microphone was hidden inside a guitar, perhaps this one. A pager and two-way radio may have been hidden from the rebels after the takeover. Listening devices may have been placed inside the walls, and there's speculation that small holes were drilled in the roof and TV cameras installed. Whatever the methods, they were effective. The attack was even delayed 8 minutes so the hostages could be warned.
We had just finished a chess game, and some hostages came and said, quiet, we are going to be liberated in a few minutes. And I thought it was a joke. 2 minutes later, a whole explosion downstairs. I thought that the whole house would collapse.
Commandos in the tunnel under the living room used 9 pounds of explosives to blast a hole in the floor, instantly killing 4 of the terrorists playing soccer directly above them.
I just dropped to the ground, saying, that is it.
You thought this was the end?
That was the end. That was the end.
The explosion signals assault troops to swarm the compound.
When you heard the first explosion,
yes.
You knew the attack was beginning.
Yes.
Were you ready to die?
I was prepared to die.
One team blasts through the front door. The other group of soldiers comes through the upstairs window, quickly killing 2 terrorists guarding the hostages there.
And immediately, more explosions and shoots and machine guns and grenades. It was incredible.
Does God approve of the use of violence to fight violence?
In some cases, it is necessary.
More explosions rock the compound, as a second wave of troops blast their way inside. Peruvian Agriculture Minister Rodolfo Muñante says a young guerrilla ran into his room.
I turned around and the young man was there pointing his gun towards me. But he didn't shoot at me.
Muñante believes the terrorists knew him too well to pull the trigger.
This young man is the one who throws the grenade, kills the officer, wounds the chancellor and the other hostage.
Commandos begin escorting the hostages from the house to safety.
How did I go out? Crawling. They told us to leave crawling.
Downstairs, rebel leader Nestor Serpa and 4 of his hostage takers have survived the explosions. They grab their weapons and desperately scramble up the stairs to the areas where the hostages are held.
Do you think they were coming to kill you?
Yes, I'm sure.
And he told us, if there is a military attack, nobody will come out alive. Nobody here.
The rebels run straight into the commandos, who have entered the house through the balcony. Serpa and his men are killed. 4 other terrorists, including the 2 women, reportedly try to surrender, but they too are gunned down. As the smoke clears and the wounded are brought out, it becomes clear the government has had a stunning success. While 1 hostage and 2 soldiers are killed, the remaining 71 hostages are rescued. All 14 of the terrorists are dead. President Fujimori, the man who built his reputation mounting a ruthless war against terrorism, takes what amounts to a victory lap around the compound, and only now has a face-to-face meeting with the rebel leader, Nestor Serpa. 2 soldiers died in the assault. One of them was Juan Valer, the mission's operations commander. Today it was revealed that his fellow commandos found a letter on Valer's body saying, "If you're reading this tomorrow, it will be because I was killed in the rescue operation. If I am not with you, please remember that I left with happiness, fighting for an operation that we planned together, an operation that unites us more than ever, and that we will see triumph." Juan Valer died before he realized that victory, but he was right. The mission did succeed, and now the living can give thanks to the dead.
A hero's funeral has been held in Peru for the soldiers and the hostage killed in the rescue. Relatives of the slain rebels say the government has refused to allow them to hold funeral services, and remaining members of the Tupac Amaru movement are now threatening a new wave of violence.